We'll recall that after decades of convergence criteria and trying to get into balance at the beginning of the Eurozone, countries came together. And this red bar sort of indicates the beginning of the Eurozone, the single currency. And what we're looking at here is output gaps, the growth in output relative to the trend in the various different countries. And what is most striking is the runaway success of Ireland and Spain. This very rapid growth, which, if we run it a bit further forward, is self-correcting, but in the most violent way imaginable. The Eurozone crisis is building up as countries move further and further apart. How that comes about, we'll see in a moment. The second thing is, there was never any exchange rate crisis, of course, in Europe. But exchange rate crises just disappear and are replaced by current account or credit crises. These are the same countries with a current account balance shown. And as you can see, divergence is the dominant feature of this graph. At the bottom, you have Spain and Ireland going into current account deficits through this period of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10% of GDP. These are very, very large by historical standards for the region. And on the other side, you have Germany and the Netherlands going in the opposite direction. We're getting the build-up of enormous macro imbalances in the Eurozone. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But first, I want to just talk about how do you respond to that? Well, one coherent and widely supported response is the view that monetary unions are incomplete institutions. They are unstable institutions, fundamentally. And the members of a monetary union have only two choices: go forward or go back. Go forward with all deliberate speed, or retreat back with all deliberate speed. Go forward meaning full political integration. Internalize those tensions, those macroeconomic tensions, within a single political federation. Or retreat back to the point at which your institutional structure is sufficient to manage the tensions of a trade area or a customs union. That's one response. And what does history tell us about that view? Well, there's a famous thing called the 1999 Bank of England question, where the governor of the Bank of England came to his young research staff and said, I want you to just go and look at all possible examples of monetary union in history and tell me which ones have succeeded. And the answer is, well, if we take Europe out of the picture, the answer is, well, not really any. You're going to respond to me in a moment with some examples, but let's stick with my story. Because the next line is, the ones that have succeeded, the answer is in the name. And they came up with 3 successful monetary unions. The answer is the name. Number 1, the United Kingdom. Scotland was incorporated into a monetary union and wrapped up in a political union. Actually, in Scotland, it was a political union followed by a monetary union. The United States of America is a monetary union built around political union. And the third one they came up with was the United Republic of Tanzania, where Zanzibar and mainland Tanganyika form a political union inside which you have a monetary union functioning. Otherwise, the claim is, no, we do not have any examples. Now, of course, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, what about the franc zone, the West African Monetary Union, the Central African Monetary Union? What about the Common Monetary Area? What about the East Caribbean Currency Board? What about the small islands of the South Pacific in monetary union with Australia and New Zealand? And the response is yes, they all exist, but none of them are unions of equals. Unions of equals without an external player playing an important macroeconomic role in those unions. What you can't find around the world are monetary unions that stand guaranteed only by themselves as groups of equals. So the role of France in and the French Treasury in helping to guarantee convertibility is critical in West Africa. The role of the Reserve Bank of South Africa, or the role of South Africa in the CMA, is absolutely dominant. That's not really a monetary union. That's a group of small countries deciding, let's hitch our wagon to a big one. Likewise in the East Caribbean or elsewhere. So there is a view that the concept of a monetary union as a union amongst equals is a very fragile one. It's an unstable equilibrium. That is a view. And here is a quote from one of the leading scholars on European monetary integration, a guy called Paul de Grauw. And it's worth just reading this out to make the point. He wrote this a couple of years ago. And it was, what lessons do you draw from Europe for East Asia? But you could apply it here. It says, the only governance that can be sustained in the Eurozone is one where a Eurozone government, backed by a Eurozone parliament, acquires the powers to tax and spend. This will also be a government that will prevail over the central bank in times of crises and not the other way round. This will also be a government that has the political legitimacy to impose macroeconomic and budgetary policies aimed at avoiding imbalances. Put differently, the Eurozone can only be sustained if it is embedded in a fiscal and political union. So there's the challenge. That is the challenge from one wing. The second response is no. Deep integration can be rendered stable with sufficient investment in the institutions required to do so. So it's the institutions required to manage divergence. Now that will require a degree of pool sovereignty, possibly more than most member states are comfortable with at present. But the argument is that with the right investment, regional integration with monetary union is a sustainable, at least over the medium term. Okay. What it requires is investment in capacity, credibility, and governance at both the national and the supranational level. It requires really powerful surveillance mechanisms and enforcement. Political enforcement of economic policy regimes is critical. It requires structural instruments at a deep level to deal with that core periphery problem that exists, but it also requires stabilization instruments in order to allow macroeconomic management to be implemented successfully. And what I want to do in my last 5 minutes or so is just talk about that macro problem and why these two tensions that I mentioned earlier are so fundamental and must be central to the way in which we think about the macroeconomic engagement on deep integration. So it's standard to think about this separation, that monetary policy is responsible for macroeconomic stabilization, to give you stable inflation and limit the volatility of output, and fiscal policy is concerned with long-run solvency, i.e. debt, with growth and distribution. Let's see how they get challenged. The first is the fiscal free rider problem. This is familiar to anyone who's thought for a moment about these problems, either in a regional integration sense or if you find yourself living in a federal structure. This is the classic free rider problem. National governments or federal, state governments, for example, make fiscal choices. They have fiscal instruments at their disposal, and they make these subject to a rule. For example, a debt ceiling or a deficit ceiling. And at any point in time, they've got two choices. They can either observe the rule, or they can violate the rule. Supranational authorities, that could be a council of ministers or the supranational central bank or any other governance institution, must decide what to do if there's violation. And they have two choices: accommodate the violation. Now, you only have to look at this little tree for a moment and you think, I can see what the equilibrium or the most likely outcome from this game is going to be. And it's simple. Because punishing is difficult, penalizing is difficult for political reasons, either because the victims of a penalty will be the people, the poor, people you're trying to protect, or because there's a solidarity consideration, I will not penalize you today because I think maybe tomorrow I need you to be gentle on me. Sort of solidarity club type of reasons. That's fully understood, which means that all institutions at the national level have a well-defined incentive to violate fiscal rules. That's the fundamental problem that most federal systems and monetary unions are going to face, that the incentives are going to be to violate the rule and to accommodate the violation. That's going to be a dominant political outcome. What does that lead to? That leads to a very strong emphasis on the role of fiscal rules. Rules that, for example, are written into the Protocol for East African Community, rules that are written into the Maastricht Treaty and the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe, an attempt to try and establish strong fiscal rules. Fiscal rules with no flexibility. That's the key point, no flexibility. My penultimate point here, and before I finish, because I know I'm going on a little bit too long, the challenge is that the Walters critique requires the opposite. It requires fiscal flexibility. It requires fiscal flexibility. Why is that? Well, here's the problem, that a single common monetary policy is generally not going to be appropriate for any individual country in the Union. And more than that, that single common monetary policy may well be positively destabilizing for countries in a monetary union. So monetary policy may be not just suboptimal, but destabilizing. This is the essence of the Walters critique. How is that? Well, think of the following example. And what matters if you think about your monetary policy is the real interest rate, the interest rate after inflation. That's what squeezes aggregate demand if you're conducting monetary policy. Imagine an individual country, let's call it Ireland for the sake of example, has a runaway growth in domestic credit. It's feeling excessively buoyant. You get rapid growth. You get overheating of that economy. You get inflation in that economy. Now, what would a central bank of Ireland do if it could? It would increase its interest rates. It would tighten the monetary policy to raise real interest rates and squeeze aggregate demand and bring that overheating under control. Okay, what's the problem? Suppose the interest rate is not set by the Bank of Ireland, but by the European Central Bank. Ireland is tiny compared to Europe as a whole. That interest rate in the European Central Bank is going to respond to a whole lot of factors, not necessarily Ireland's overheating. So, imagine the interest rate doesn't increase. Well, what's happening in Ireland? You've got a low interest rate and rising inflation. So what direction is the real interest rate, the thing that matters, going? It's not increasing, it's going the other way. Exactly at the time when you want to tighten your monetary policy, being part of a monetary union moves it in the wrong direction. So you are stoking this overheating economy. It's getting hotter and hotter because you do not have the monetary policy instrument to do the right thing. So, what do you need? What do you need to do? You need another instrument. And what is that instrument? How do you take aggregate demand out of the Irish economy? You need fiscal policy. You need discretion on fiscal policy, on public expenditure, on taxation. There's the fundamental tension that comes at the macroeconomic level within a monetary union. And here's the story. Early 2000s, Ireland is overheating. What happens to the interest rate? Well, it rises a little bit because Germany isn't overheating. Actually, Germany is in a recession. So then the ECB starts to lower its interest rates because it's worried about the Eurozone, i.e. mainly Germany. As those interest rates lower and inflation in Ireland rises and Spain, boom, they've got these negative real interest rates below the line here. They're the ones that have got the wrong macro policy. There are no fiscal signals. Everything looks great on the fiscal front. There's no fiscal action and no pressure from the centre to take offsetting fiscal action. The reason is, if you're in a boom, your tax receipts look really good, especially if you're in a real estate boom, which is Ireland and Spain. So they were just going superbly well on the fiscal front. Big surpluses, everything's fine, but actually everything was absolutely not fine because they were following fiscal rules and not fiscal discretion. And what do I mean by that? There's the adjustment. The Eurozone, this is the 2008 crisis, the Eurozone has a bit of a tough time. Look at Ireland and Spain. That's a direct consequence of this incomplete fiscal architecture that I was talking about. Okay, last 2 or 3 minutes, Mr. Chair, if I may. So, the tension is there. Fiscal rules to try and offset the temptation to act in a free-riding manner. Free-riding means that other countries are carrying the cost of your fiscal indiscipline. Hit that with rules, versus the Walters critique that says you need the fiscal flexibility to complement the absence of monetary flexibility in a monetary zone. How do you square this off? And that's my final couple of points. The 3 key elements, and I'm just going to talk about them as funds, because beneath that there's a whole set of political economy and political issues. You need structural instruments and structural funds to deal with the fundamental tensions in any regional integration. These are budgetary commitments. These are not meant to be symmetric over time. Some countries will be structurally more dependent on these funds than others. This means that some countries will be paying into the structural funds in perpetuity and some will be drawing them down in perpetuity. That is a political tension. That's why my government at home says we don't like to pay all this money into the European Union when Ireland and Greece and Portugal take it all. That's an absence of political solidarity. That's a structural point. Stabilisation funds are the way in which you try and address the Walters critique. It's about creating a framework that allows for fiscal or quasi-fiscal complementary policy to allow countries to manage the short-run macroeconomics without getting into this severe divergence problem that's created by the common monetary policy. Stabilisation facilities, the obvious model for this, in a sense, is the IMF's program. The IMF's program, particularly during the period of fixed exchange rates, from 1945 to 1971. That's exactly how the funds programs worked. It was about providing resources under surveillance, rules, and conditionality to allow countries to respond to shocks in a way that is least disruptive to domestic economic activity. That's what a stabilization facility is about. This should be self-financing. It should be, if these are cyclical shocks, it should be self-financing, not a structural issue. And the final thing is a lender of last resort, a fundamental role for a central bank to provide short-term liquidity to the financial sector. Why I mention that at the end is that as soon as you move into a monetary union, you lose not just monetary policy, but you unravel the notion that any national government can monetize its debt. Domestic debt, domestic currency debt, the seigniorage revenue of the nation state is gone. There's collective seigniorage, but it's not national. And so you're turning domestic debt into essentially foreign debt, or debt to the union as a whole. That creates a lot of liquidity problems, and lender of last resort facilities, which were shockingly absent in Europe in conventional ways. They exist in non-conventional ways. Those facilities are crucial. Okay, they cost. They cost a lot, and this will be my final point. How much does it cost to do this? We've only one really good example, and that is Europe. Structural funds are approximately 1%, slightly more, of European GDP. Sorry, no, the European budget is about that. The structural funds are about 40% of the budget. So that's not That's not a lot of money for a group of rich countries. But if you think of 1% of GDP in an environment where, say, revenue is maybe 15 to 20% of GDP, scale that up by a factor of 5. So you're talking about, just for structural funds, maybe about 5%, or for a budget that supports structural funds, maybe 5% of total revenue in a monetary union. Any of you from the East African community might like to have a look at how much member states currently pay to the East African community, or more precisely, currently do not pay. I think every country is in arrears, and the amount that's currently contributed to the EAC budget is absolutely tiny. It's nowhere near 5% of revenue. So there's a really interesting scale issue. Stabilization funds, way more expensive, but they can be financed through bond markets to some extent. In Europe, you're talking about 4 to 5% of European GDP. That's a huge number. It can be engineered in a way that it's not quite as large as that, but it is a very substantial financial commitment, a commitment that's required if the twin tensions of the Walters critique and the fiscal free rider problem can be reconciled in an efficient way. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adam, for being so provocative. I'm sure the audience is very much provoked. Thank you very much. But now it remains, I don't want to steal his thunder, it remains to Gibson, Chikumira, to make some comments on this.
Like this, not okay. Thank you very much, Chair. May I start really by thanking the AERC for providing me this opportunity, and thank Professor Chris Adams for a very rich presentation. I also had the opportunity to read through the paper, which I think he has really summarized the paper, but there's a lot in the paper which is very rich. I think he started by asking the question, why deep regional integration? Is this the path that we want to go? And I think he concurred with the sentiments that were coming in this morning, that yes, regional integration is good for us. We need to proceed with regional integration. But this session being what it is, to rethink regional integration, I think there are a number of issues that have been raised in the presentation as well as in the paper with regards to rethinking. Firstly, if you look at the progression of regional integration that he showed, the question is, are we moving the full scale? What is the timing of framework? When should we be there? And also, basing from history, countries that have gone, we're looking at, I think in the paper he cites the European Union as one of the examples that most of the countries, particularly in Africa, have been looking at. If we look at that their rate of progression and the institutions that they have built over time and the pace at which we are going, do we have the requisite institutions that can then support that growth? I think in the paper is highlighted that one of the lessons, key lessons that we can learn from Europe is one, the depth of the institutional foundation. So I think the one issue that we need to grapple with as we look at the issues that I've raised is the depth of our institutional foundations within our regional economic communities, as well as the other element which we touched last, which I'll also come back to, is the issue of financial and other commitments. Because that's key. Regional integration is an expensive process that also requires adequate resourcing to be able to carry out some of the mandates that they are. And particularly the issue that he was talking about, there are winners and losers. You need to compensate. There are also those structural funds that are there. So that's the point he raised. And he also raised the issue of whether we are too ambitious on this agenda or not. We need to reflect on that. We also need to reflect on something he highlighted, whether if the monetary union has all these costs, do we revert back to consolidation of the customs union or the single market, or we go all the way? I think it's raised in the paper, and I'll also come back and issues. But the other issue that he also highlighted, and I think it's also coming in the presentation as well as in the paper, the issue of political commitment towards having a political federation. And commitment is one thing, but resourcing is another. Then the other aspect that I picked in his presentation, and it came through much strongly in the paper, is that, particularly in the paper, he highlighted that creation of a single currency within the context of a monetary union is not a technical monetary step, because it's an easy thing. And if you look at the time frames that we have set ourselves, it appears that within 2 years we'll achieve a monetary union. But there are a number of steps, there are a number of tensions which he highlighted, and tensions which will not necessarily lead to the outcome that we deserve. There are tensions that will bring in political resistance. He highlighted the issue that some of these concepts, regional integration, is not just an economic concept, but we are also looking at the political considerations. So it's not a simple technical step. It's about real economic integration, pooling of economic sovereignty. There are aspects that he was talking about, the institutions that we need to set up, which are supranational institutions. For you to have them, you then have to cede some political power to that supranational institution. The question that we need to digest is, what is the appetite among our politicians to cede that sovereignty? If you had the discussions that we had early in the morning, I think issues were coming up about national versus regional interests, which tells you that there could be a tension in terms of ceding that supranational authority, sovereignty for our nation states to a supranational national body. And also the process places demands on national as well as the various supranational fiscal institutions in terms of how this whole thing and project can be funded. I think he highlighted in the paper as well as in the discussions in terms of the economic benefits of regional integration. I think there's no contention in that area in terms of the largeness of the market, scales of economy, having common infrastructure. I think those areas are pretty agreed upon. But there are other issues that where you're looking at the challenges of ensuring that the growth payoffs to regional integration is balanced, inclusive, which I think the Prof did highlight. And it is those areas of cost and how these costs are shared across countries begin to provide some threats. I think in the paper he called them existential threats that can arise. So we need to look at how those threats can actually be resolved. And he did talk about the monetary union not being a stable and political equilibrium, where countries face the two choices that he talked about, advancing and possibly rapidly towards a full and credible political union, such as the political federation envisaged in the European, East African community, and I think it's also in SADC as well. So I think the question is, which we need to interrogate this aspect, this choice, given the instability of the next stage of deepening regional integration. Do we consolidate? Do we retreat? If we don't, and we want to proceed to the next stage, which requires us to have the various supranational institutions, are we prepared? And with the time it takes, how long? So I think those are issues that we need to interrogate. Then there's the aspect of retreating back to a much looser structure of regional integration and based on customs union and single market. I like the analysis he did in the paper, which was not highlighted in his presentation, but he talked about some of the evidence from history. And I picked in the paper where he is looking at the case of the UK, for example, which was in the Eurozone, but it was not a member of the Eurozone, but a member of the, it remained a member of the EU before the Greek exit, but chose not to participate in the Eurozone. In other words, it was benefiting from the benefits of a customs union, the benefits of a single market, but they didn't go the next step. The same, I think, is also in the paper where he talked about, at no stage, Canada and US in their free trade areas agreement in the 1980s, or its successor, NAFTA, there is, in that case, there's a view that there's regional economic integration and the integrity of the free trade area, but there's an absence of the monetary union. The ASEAN nations as well, I think it's highlighted in the paper, they've made significant progress, and I think it was highlighted in the morning. But the point I like from what was said, while they made that progress, they have been discussing the issue of moving to the next level of a monetary union, but that has not happened. Then also, so what this is saying, it highlights the questions, the options that he has talked about. Given the tensions that are there, should we move to the next stage? And if we move to the next stage, I think he has highlighted and amplified the tensions. We then need to look at how do we mitigate some of those risks. And I think that's, the purpose of this rethinking. Then, in doing so, if we go to the next level of the monetary union, and there is need for creating of those supranational institutions, which then create fiscal as well as risk sharing mechanisms. There is need to look at how greater coordination of fiscal issues are done. I think he did talk about some of the political consideration of regional integration, where you are bringing in solidarity to ensure that you move together as a region. But the history of implementing, or non-implementation for that matter, of regional integration initiatives suggests that commitment is not followed by resources. If we look at, in creating supranational institutions, if you look at the RECs, for instance, how are these RECs currently funded? Are we fully funding them as a region, or they are being funded by development partners, which creates a challenge of sustainability of these institutions and the work that they do? Then there's also the issue of providing the enabling framework. It's one thing to have the commitment, it's one thing to decide that you want to have these institutions, but you then need to have the enabling frameworks, legal frameworks, which then brings in the role of our parliaments in this whole debate. So establishing and sustainability of supranational institutions require substantial financial commitments of our governments, as well as facilities, including the structural and stabilization funds that he did talk about. And also within the addressing the issue of the free rider problem that he highlighted. And I think within the context of the European Union, this is one area they worked on, and providing the institutions that can be able to deal with that. Then he did talk about the upping of regional integration into the next level. I think the point he raised is that the central policy challenge facing policymakers is that when countries are faced with the monetary union, they accept the centralized common monetary and exchange rate policy, which is managed by the central bank. But the point he also raised that the point he also raised that the fiscal policy is at government level. That in itself creates a huge tension, which needs to be addressed. And I think this is where the stabilization fund comes in. I'm told my time is up. But I think one other area that you did talk about is some of the challenges and the policy coordination challenges that face the common monetary union. And I think this is an area that we need to look at and digest and be able to come up conclusively with the way forward. I think the last point, Chair, I see my time is up. where he was talking about rules versus discretion, I think we are in the realm of the moral hazard problem and the too big to fail kind of phenomena, where you also have implicit guarantees. So it's an area that really needs to be looked at closely and see how those loopholes can be corrected through an institutional framework to manage some of the challenges. I think I'll rest my case here, Chair. Thank you.
Two wonderful people who put so much on the table for us now to chew, swallow, and digest. So I'll move over now to the audience to add to what has been done, to challenge, if you challenge, and then maybe chart a better way forward, maybe a new proposal or something. Dr. New Farmer, then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much.
I said Dr. New Farmer first. At the back.
Okay.
Yeah. And Dr. New Farmer behind you. Please introduce yourself so that others get to know you.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Richard Newfarmer. I'm the Country Director for the International Growth Center for Uganda and Rwanda. Thank you very much. Very fine explanation of the tensions in regional trade agreements and regional monetary unions, and likewise, I thought the comment was absolutely brilliant. Two quick questions. One is, it seems to me that the tensions that you described might be heightened in a situation in which economies are rather small, commodity exporting, and therefore subject to external shocks of price volatility on the market, and that particularly works to the advantageous conduct of a collective monetary and fiscal policy when the shocks affect countries differentially. So the question is, do these differential tax policy about disciplines on export subsidies within the region or disciplines on industrial policy, working at the regional level approach leading to a better, first of all, customs union and single market, and eventually laying the stage for monetary union should that occur. The question is, can the monetary union be a useful sort of goal even if you work on this convergence agenda? And if so, what are the steps, what are the highlights, what are the issues on that convergence agenda?
Okay, thank you. I'm Abi Kadir from University of Sheffield in the UK. I have 3 points. Briefly, I will make first reference to the... Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. I'm Abi Kadir from University of Sheffield in the UK. I have one question with regards to coordination, which is a point well articulated by Franny, and you highlighted it. That is in reference to the political coordination for the centralized monetary policy. When we look at some coordination failures in the past, the role of trust is very, very important. And I would be happy if you make some comment on that point. The second point is about the experience of European Union and what Africa can learn from the pace and the form of integration that is taking place there, or what is happening in Europe, whether it can inform what is going on in our continent. And the final point is just a simple macro policy question on the stabilization role of fiscal policy. As we know, the role for fiscal policy within developing countries or emerging economies is very limited because they tend to be pro-cyclical. Therefore, the burden on monetary policy is, I think, is very obvious. Therefore, what role do they really play?
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Joel Sinsu from the Ministry of Investment, Trade and Industry in Botswana. I would like to thank the Professor Adams and Dr. Chikumira for the presentations they've given to us. I have a question that is applicable to both of you. Looking at the experience of the Eurozone, in the analysis and discussions that you have given to us, the tensions that is there in terms of moving to deeper regional integration, the issue of winners and losers, and you know, when you look at countries at different levels of development, is it not like it may be wise that there could be a certain level of development, or where should, in terms of the steps to say monetary union, maybe for certain countries there is a level where we should stop. If I look at, say, African countries, it might be wise to define and say, okay, for countries at the level of this development, countries with a mixture of developing and more developed countries, this kind of mixture of the regional integration, they would be better placed if they go into integration to this level, and then after a certain level of development of the region, they move to the next stages. Otherwise, from the discussion, it appears like if you look at it, it may be difficult, especially for us in developing countries, to move to those stages of monetary union and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Menuga is my name from the ADB. Now, it looks like we are back to where we started in the morning on this word of rethinking. Because in this presentation is a journey of regional integration. And Chris has shown us the end road of that journey, which is when you have what he called the political union. Before that, you need to have a monetary union. Now, from the presentation, we saw that the three countries that have achieved that political union, which he mentioned to us, UK, USA, and Tanzania, are those that have achieved complete, in other words, politics was united with economics, in the sense that it ended up being one country. We couldn't lay much emphasis on the issue of what happened in Australia or New Zealand, where one country remains, and some people are latching on it. So which means that, other than this, we have no other example to say that this is where we're heading to in terms of achieving the end point. The stage before the end point, which is the monetary union, European Union could have been an example for us to work towards, where that still remains one today. But in the next 5 years, we don't know whether anybody is going to pull out or not. But UK, that we were hoping that one day was eventually going to join the European Union, we now know that that is not going to be. So the question back to us in terms of rethinking is, Africa, when we are talking of regional integration, what really do we mean? Where are we going? We mentioned industrialization in the morning, that we are looking forward to East Asia, the Asian tigers, for us to do what they did, many of them. Have we been able to do one? And then the dream is regional integration. One point that has struck me so much is when Chukwuchukwu was talking, he reminded us that if you have an airport at the middle of the city in your own country that is going to connect to the rest of the world, you are on course on integration. So we need, as we're going back from this place, to really know what is realistic and what is not, so that when we talk about this regional integration, which we have been hearing in terms of is the way to go, is going forward, no going back, where are we going and what do we mean? So maybe we may have to have another conference on monetary union so that we know where we're going and then begin to implement realistic goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions, one for Professor Adam and the other for Dr. Chigumira. For Professor Adam, you mentioned that we would need solutions that are structural, but also both on the fund side and the instrument side. It's easier to create funds, it's harder to manage them sustainably. It's harder to create institutions, but once they're in place, they do function. Could you give us your thoughts on where you think different regions of Africa can be served by one or the other, and what we should be thinking about in going forward with those types of responses? And then Dr. Chigumira, I wanted to ask you if you would share any examples that you have observed in the different regional groupings we have of centrifugal forces that are beginning to tear apart whatever progress has been achieved thus far. Thank you.
Thank you, Franny. Then I will take one more. We will come in the second round. Maybe we give them a chance. Yeah, the lady. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I think I've enjoyed very much the presentation and thinking about the deepening.
Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Rose Ngugi from Kipra, Kenya. Thinking about deepening integration in the African continent, I'm trying to ask myself, same thing as my colleague, where are we going? In the sense that we have a very good route that you've taken us through, FTA, customs union, political union. But then if you think about East African community, we are at a different stage. SADC, we are at a different stage. We have now what we are calling the tripartite. I don't know where it's supposed to take us if we take the EEC, COMESA, and SADC. And then we also have a new initiative, the African Union, and this is the CFTA. All of them at very different stages. When we talk about deepening, what are we talking about? Is it the several blocks deepening among themselves, or the continent itself gaining some deepening as far as the integration is concerned? I'm a bit not clear what is the deepening we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take the second round. For now, I would like to go to our speaker and discuss and to address what has been raised so far.
Thank you. These are great questions. Thank you very much. As you probably gathered from my presentation, I could take another 45 minutes just answering them, but I won't. I know it's late in the day. Let me just pick up a few of these as I go through, and then I'll pass it over to Gibson. I think Richard made a really interesting point about are these tensions magnified if you're dealing with groupings where countries are resource dependent, so shocks may be larger, but more importantly, that they're differentially resource dependent across the union. So a fall in the oil price might be great for an oil importer, but not so good for an oil exporter, and if they are in a monetary union, what sort of tension does that place on the institutions of the monetary union when one part is arguing for a tightening of monetary policy, the other for a loosening of monetary policy. I think that's absolutely right. There is some modelling on this. I got one of my graduate students to work on this, and of course, being economists, it was all very straightforward because we used the wrong model and it was all too slick, and we didn't actually grapple with the political economy of this. There was quite a lot of work done in the run-up to the European Union on exactly these sorts of issues. And one of the conceits, I think, at that time was the point that I raised earlier, that a lot of these tensions are not self-correcting. And there was a fairly strong confidence in markets and in deep convergence rather than divergence, that the process of creating a monetary union would lead to greater synchronization of business cycles, which in turn makes a common monetary policy more appropriate for more of the union more of the time, and so kind of reduces those tensions. I think the evidence from Europe suggests that was a false optimism, at least given the institutional structures at the time. So I think this issue about strongly differential production structures is really important. One way of thinking about it is it really does raise the stakes for any pooled fiscal intervention, be it stabilization or structural. But on your second point, the focus on the convergence agenda, I'd make two quick observations. One, hitting the initial convergence criteria is in some sense necessary, but as my picture suggested, far from sufficient for the effective continuation of a monetary union. But I do very much support your second point, that does the notion that there's a medium-term commitment to deeper integration serve as a valuable focal point for better policy coordination in the interim? And I think the answer is absolutely yes, and I think this part of the world highlights that. In 2013, the heads of state made a commitment in the Monetary Union Protocol, and the idea is a movement towards monetary union by 2024. I think that's highly unlikely, except by accident. And it would be quite a dangerous accident if it occurred. But what is happening in terms of coordination on information sharing, cross-border clearance and settlement in the financial sector, thinking about the regulatory framework for cross-border capital flows, thinking about harmonization of policy coordination, policy dialogue, I think it's a really positive spillover from this initiative that has been going on over the last 5 or 6 years. The problem is we've got to play a trick that works if people believe that there is an end point, but if at the same time you're saying we don't believe in the end point, there's a question about how credible that convergence agenda is. On Kadir's points, the experience of the European Union for this part of the world is really important, but with a very important caveat, that when you look at the protocol for East African monetary union, this is the bit that I know best from Europe, but it was a blueprint. 2006. It was a story of success. It was a story that said, here's how you introduce a monetary union, here's how you do a single currency, this is the governance and institutional structure you need. So the protocol looks like the Maastricht Treaty, which I think is a real danger. But I think the really important point to take away is that l'Europe se fera en crise, the crisis of 2010, has led to quite a profound rethinking about the governance structures within Europe. And it's that rethinking that the countries of sub-Saharan Africa need to focus on, not the architecture of Maastricht. It's what's happened since. And so the various reforms that themselves are still very incomplete, but I think they give us a better sense of some of the challenges there. You're absolutely right on the fiscal policy, the pro-cyclicality. I think, what that does, it's certainly true if you had good automatic stabilizers and a lot of counter-cyclical fiscal structure, Walter's critique problem is much less severe. But given that fiscal policy is quite pro-cyclical, that just says the stakes are even higher when you're thinking about how important stabilization and fiscal flexibility is. I'm dodging your first question, but I might come back to it in a second about trust and coordination. Is there a level of development? I think Gibson made the point very clearly that one of the key things about the European Union experience is the depth of institutional foundations. I think that's what you look at. It's partly the structure of economies. Does it make sense to think about these very differently structured economies together in running a common monetary and trade policy? But it also depends on whether you feel that the political and fiscal institutions are deeply enough grounded to sustain the required cooperation to make an institution work. And I suspect the answer to that is one that says customs union, free trade, SACU type of arrangements, those work quite well. Let's not move too quickly. You've got to remember that this story started in Europe in 1960, not 10 years ago. Two very quick final points. The East Asian story, I think, is really interesting. And there it goes back to this point about regional integration as a focal point without tying countries' hands. The Chiang Mai initiative is a very powerful cooperative economic arrangement that does not bind the hands of members of the Chiang Mai initiative to the point where they're kind of straining against the fiscal obligations and the sovereignty obligations. And finally, penultimately, Franny, I think one of the interesting points is what I said. I think the examples of institutions that work, this may not sit comfortably with people, but in a sense, the governance structures and the surveillance structures operated by the IMF give us quite a lot of the elements of an institutional structure that may be important to supporting deeper regional integration. But the key thing is thinking about the power and authority of the executive board and the governing council of institutions like that, as much as it is about the systems of surveillance, the human capital required to make surveillance effective, and the level of political engagement required to negotiate agreements. But you're absolutely right, dead easy to create the fund, much harder to monitor it well and have it on a sound institutional basis. So let me pass to
Okay. Thank you very much. I think most of the issues have been addressed by Chris. I think from the issue that was raised on the issue of fiscal policy being pro-cyclical, and I think there is evidence, even in our own context, that most of the instability that's happening in our country is the money supply as well as inflation. And on the issue of fiscal policy having automatic stabilizers, I think there's evidence that African context, which means the point you are raising that it's not self-correcting, the fiscal system is not self-correcting. You then need a deliberate intervention to be able to address that. And if there's an institution, then that institution has to respond timelessly and appropriately, otherwise it will respond when the cycle has already changed. I think on the issue that was raised by Joe, I think on the European experience in college, I think it was the issue of borrowed credibility. I think peripheral states within Europe, they joined the monetary union, European Monetary Union, as a way of also ensuring that there is policy credibility and reputation of the policymakers. But again, with some of the challenges that have obtained, when they were trying to meet the convergence criteria, things begin to surface. And I think the point that Chris raised, that some of the countries that have been perpetually paying into the stabilization fund begin to feel that this is now a permanent arrangement rather than a temporal and transitory arrangement where you are helping a country to move out of a crisis. But if you are perpetually in a crisis and there is evidence of some of these free rider problems, then it affects the entire group, because there are evidence of moral hazard issues emerging. Then, okay, I think on the issue of ADB, sure, that's the end game where we are going. But I think about us having realistic goals and targets that we want to achieve. While we want to go there and we have made a commitment, what we tend to find sometimes we push ourselves so hard and we put timelines which we are not able to achieve. But it can also achieve another purpose. For your citizens and observers, they then begin to, you suffer from a credibility problem. If we set a goal and we don't achieve that particular goal and we extend it by another 10 years, it tells us something. Either we have not done diagnostic and critical analysis very well. So it's an area that we need to look at. That's where we want to go, but let's set realistic timeframes and the roadmap that we are following. Then from Franny raised the question of some examples where we are beginning to see some of these centrifugal forces happening. I think one of the issues that I think Prof. Chris did raise is that you do have some context-specific shocks that are country-specific, but that are not affecting the entire region. And that does force the regional authorities to change course. But for the country itself, that's a big challenge. And that then ignites political tension and pressure because of that divergence to do other things. And that's why you are beginning to see a number of even tax and tariff reforms that have been made actually being reversed. In some cases, you see an increase in protectionism. In some cases, you also begin to see an increase in different forms of non-tariff barriers being instituted into places. Zimbabwe is a case in point where when we went into hyperinflation and we wanted a solution out of it, one way during the debate there is either we adopt full dollarization, or I remember it actually being mentioned in one of the budget statements that we are likely to then proceed into a monetary union. So that once we're in a monetary union, we have no need to be thinking about this other currency arrangement. But this was a Zimbabwean problem. It was not a SADC-wide problem. So which meant the appetite of moving into a monetary union was a one-country problem, but not an entire regional. So there are idiosyncratic shocks that do occur. And there is need of how do you address this, and this is where the supranational institution, which is well resourced, can be able to address some of those challenges in time, so that it doesn't destabilize the entire region. I think the other area you also see countries agree, protocols are produced to facilitate implementation, but those protocols, they are not signed. And you then ask yourself, why are they not being signed? Chances are countries are beginning to see certain things that they had not anticipated, and they would rather defer signing of the protocols. I think that's all I would say. Thank you.
I will just take two more, then we have to, because we are run out of time. So please.
Thank you, Chair. Once again, Dick Kamganga from Uganda National Farmers Federation. And we, the farmers, we don't like ambiguity. We get confused every time the weather patterns are not properly predicted. And in this respect, I take to the precurrent speaker from the audience asking, where are we going? I would like to ask the African Economic Research Consortium, which is the largest capacity building and think tank on the continent, to rethink also its research agenda, such that this agenda can guide us and can guide these policymakers on finding exactly which direction we have to take. The question the good professor from Oxford asked, I think from Oxford, if I'm right, I mean the steps he took us through where do we have the most gains as a region? What are the costs and benefits for each of those regions, for each of those stages? Do we need really to move for the monetary union if it is more costly for us? And people, as we are seeing an increasing sense of, others have called it responsible nationalism, others have called it anti-globalization, but we're seeing the increasing agitation against the global forces. And then we, the farmers, we do not know what exactly, which direction to say. So the question, my recommendation in this meeting, therefore, as a farmer, is to the AERC to expand its research agenda to be precisely guide the policymakers on the continent. Where should we stop and on board on regional integration? Thank you very much.
Dr. Bruce.
Thank you very much. So I was already speaking this morning, but I couldn't resist coming back just on three points. Because lots of the questions that have been raised are about what's the end game, how do we move through this process. But the stages that were presented, which come from this Bella Balassa paper, right, of the different sort of levels of economic integration, we look at those as though they're a process that needs to be followed, when in fact, when they were sort of discussed, these are just different levels of integration. So that it's not necessarily that this is a path that needs to be followed. They're kind of, as you kind of suggested, there are endpoints within which can be kind of chosen. So indeed, I think, given the example of the European Union, there's been this sort of implicit assumption that everything has to move forward, all the way to political federation. And I think my sense is that what's happening in reality, so now the sort of the second point, is that in all of the African RECs, they're very far from supranational institutions. So even in ECOWAS, where you have a commission which has a sort of a legal authority, in reality, these are intergovernmental bodies. And they're intergovernmental bodies where within the treaties and within the different protocols, there's a huge amount of flexibility actually built in. So sort of we talk as though sort of countries are breaking the rules, but very often actually they're following the rules, they're perhaps abusing the rules, but it's sort of these rules are built in, which then leads to this situation of maybe there isn't a kind of sense of having to go forward or go back. Maybe there is a possibility of having this kind of long-term limbo where there's a kind of consolidation and you kind of have this sort of proximity of people, which I think is a good point to raise. And then that just leads me to a third point on the EU story. I mean, so I guess my point is that it's not helpful always to look at the EU very much. But one point from the EU was the Treaty of Rome was in 1957. I think it was in 1982, there was a headline from Economist saying, is the EU dead, or it's stillborn or something, or in a coma. And it's essentially after that that the European Roundtable of Industrialists began to see the threat from sort of globalization elsewhere and the need for them to kind of establish this internal market. So it was in the 80s with this private sector drive that began to really create the momentum that then led to sort of regarnering some of this progress. So in a way, sort of what that raises to me is that, again, this role we discussed this morning of sort of the different partners, who needs this to happen? And it also actually raises a question about to what degree does integration have to go through the regional organizations? I think lots of the things we also even discussed in infrastructure was about cooperation or cross-border collaboration. Somebody mentioned the tripartite or the Northern Corridor group, which is not actually operating through the EAC and not actually sort of part of these wider things. This sort of multitude of different ways of cooperating regionally is perhaps something which is worth exploring more now, instead of sort of fixating on sort of an end goal which is not necessarily realistic nor desirable at the moment.
Bon, merci Monsieur le Président pour votre indulgence. Très rapidement, donc, on peut retenir que le problème des agendas africains, c'est un problème de crédibilité. Nous prenons des engagements et nous avons des difficultés à les tenir. Mais mon intervention porte sur 2 points au moins. Lorsqu'on considère l'itinéraire de l'Europe, en 1996, il y a eu le pacte de stabilité qui disait, bon, dans tous les cas, en 1999, il y aura la monnaie unique avec les pays qui auront réalisé les critères de convergence. Cela veut dire qu'on peut faire une option d'évolution à vitesse différenciée dans une union monétaire et puis les autres progressivement vont y entrer. Est-ce que dans l'étude des situations africaines, que ce soit dans la zone Afrique australe ou la zone ouest africaine, vos recherches vous ont permis peut-être d'étudier ce genre de situation? Première observation. La deuxième, c'est finalement, face à ce pessimisme-là, parce que l'intégration monétaire en Afrique, ce serait pour les calendes grecques, comme on dit en français. Est-ce qu'il n'est pas possible d'envisager une alternative différente de ce qu'on peut appeler les externalités de l'intégration monétaire, de faire en sorte que même optimales ne sont pas réalisées, en fait entièrement réalisées, qu'il y ait un niveau sous-optimal de telle sorte que la discipline collective aide à réaliser progressivement et qu'on avance sur le chemin de l'intégration monétaire et finalement de l'intégration économique. Merci. Please be very brief because we are out of time.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, I'm Bernard, Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Tanzania. In your presentation, you mentioned 3 examples of successful monetary union, which is the United Kingdom, United Republic of Tanzania, and the United States of America. And these were all preceded by a political union and then back to the monetary union. Even with EU being successful at building some strong institution, yet they haven't been able to record, a successful form of monetary union. So the question is, do you think that should be the route for building a successful monetary union in Africa or in some of, the sub-regional integration, the political union first? Thank you.
These are enormous questions that I didn't want to give the impression that there was a kind of determinism in the move through stages of integration. I actually took that from the website of the EAC. Talked about their pillars. Could be the same, slightly different format. Now, whether this is just whether it's just a device or it is a genuine intention, a device possibly structured stage, or that this is a kind of an inevitable questions, and I certainly agree then that I don't think there is. I think this way in which you describe a relatively stable, quite flexible set of arrangement, I find that quite plausible. I think what is interesting and dangerous is that you do have these is the time to do it, and without a little bit like there's quite serious risks of premature monetary integration for the consequences for the region. My emphasis on learning from Europe is very much about the governance structure for the monetary union. And I think you do have to be quite Eurocentric about this for the institutions that are being considered in this part of the world, because there are no other examples of, and even Europe is not a union of equals as such. You still have to ask the question, who plays the Bundesbank role in any of these monetary unions, where the big anchors are. But I think the understanding the process of learning from their own mistakes are quite useful in the governance structure there. Is there a suboptimal route to, two things. One is the variable convergence possibilities in this suboptimal route towards monetary union. I think the reality is that any such movements are deeply suboptimal. I don't think there are any optimal currency areas anywhere in the world that we could think of. Europe definitely isn't. At best, Europe is two, one north of the Alps and one south of the Alps, but it's not one. I would argue that East Africa is more of an optimal currency union than Europe is, but neither are particularly close. I think answering your question is going back to Bruce's question in a sense. There's a kind of a functional, incremental, operational view of convergence that clearly doesn't require full monetary union, and certainly not over any reasonable horizon. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to come back on the Deputy Governor's point, other than what I wanted to do was to use these historical examples to highlight the fact that fundamentally we're talking about a political process, not an economic process. One of the biggest mistakes I found in the early discussion of the East African Monetary Union discussions is this widespread belief that monetary union was about monetary policy, and monetary union is absolutely not about monetary policy. It's political and it's about fiscal. And a big part of saying all that I said was to try and make sure that we don't get seduced into thinking it's a piece of technical monetary engineering. It's, with all due respect to central bankers, that's not what it's about. It's a fundamentally political question. I can't answer that question saying, do I think that there's a sufficient political will to move in the region? But maybe we can follow this up later. Let me stop at that point. I know I've not done justice to everyone.
Thank you very much. I don't have much to say. I think the only point I can highlight is that when you look at the regional integration arrangements in our continent, they've been predominantly driven at the political level. And sometimes there's a disconnect even with the private sector to know what the pace where we are. But the example that you raised, that in Europe it was actually later driven by the private sector, because when markets integrate, it's the private sector that have to drive production and benefits that can accrue. So there is also that need for that link to be strengthened and also move with the private sector. I think that's what I can say.
Thank you very much. I think it remains for me to just say that, and doing great injustice to the presentation and discussion, but to say, I think the speaker started by affirming that benefits expected from integration still stand, provided it's done properly. So we are not questioning benefits that derive from integration, but integration is dynamic. It's never stationary. Either it's subjected to centrifugal forces or centripetal forces. And in moving forward, first things first, there has to be a proper sequence, and there should be, or shall I say, safeguards or safety measures must be devised. So institutional response to tensions, divergences will be required. So things like structural instruments and structural funds, stabilization facilities would be needed, a lender of last resort role, and the question of the high costs involved and how they would be shared. And that design is very important, it's very crucial in setting up these institutions and making sure that they adhere to that design. So monetary union is highly likely to succeed if embedded in an appropriate, conducive fiscal and political setting. In other words, maybe political and fiscal union. So deep integration can sustain but need to skillfully manage tensions and divergences. So tread carefully, maybe move forward, but tread carefully. And I think Gibson was a very constructive discussant, not adversarial. I think he added, he elaborated on some of the points. So he added a lot of value to what Adam says. I will not, for the sake of time, narrate, but I have some points on how I saw you adding to the excellent work that Adam has done. Just to conclude by saying, even at a continental level, like the timetable, because it says that the yes and so on. Of when we move from OAU, which was liberation, to AU, which is economic, social. Institutions, African Central, very little movement. Central banks have been wrestling with convergence criteria, the macro, in order to there as first things first. And it has been at snail's pace, maybe even an old sick snail. Very, very slow, you can hardly see movement. You need special instruments to detect movement. Then Pan-African Investment Bank, which also it was not clear how they would be related to African Development Bank and existing regional development banks, which are doing very well indeed in financing development in Africa. That was to be based in Libya. Then there is African Monetary Fund, where the statutes have been approved, but nobody has signed yet, and ratification is still zero. But I think statutes were done 3 years ago. Then there was to be Visual Stock Exchange, which is in the hands of the private sector. Also, it has almost been dormant. Movement on that has been dormant. Let's thank the speaker very much, Adam, and the discussant, Gibson. Please, let's give them a hand. They were excellent, they were superb, and you participants, clap for yourselves. You came with and AERC for bringing us together. Thank you for that. So let's digest this. This was a very rich paper, rich discussions. Let's think and let's come to the author and the discussant in corners during the tea break and cocktail tomorrow, and come back to AERC and give all those points and to the author so that they can polish. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ambassador to the EU and then AU Commissioner. And it's also, by the way, is coming on ARC board as well. Okay? So that's great. I think you will also be joining tomorrow's public policy roundtable. There will be a lot of discussions that will actually be conducted at the roundtable tomorrow. And there's one area that we didn't discuss today. This has to do with service markets, integrating African service markets. There will be a presentation of ARC network research tomorrow. I guess with this, we're going to end the day, and thank you very much. Okay.
After tea break, we'll have dinner at 7 o'clock. Dinner will be at Marina Club. Marina Club is a walking distance for those who want to walk, but we'll provide transport at 6:45. So those who are free and want to take a walk, please, Marina is just next to the lake. Thank you very much. Dress is informal, not necessarily formal.
Marina, c'est combien de kilomètres? Non, mais ça prend les 18 heures déjà.